Have you ever wondered what God can do with a life that's completely surrendered? Not a partial surrender made between distractions and fears, but the kind that says, "Lord, I place all my desires, plans, and dreams in your hands. I surrender." This video isn't about faith theorists. It's about real men and women who dared to live that way without holding anything back. Ordinary people, often forgotten, who chose to yield when everything around them screamed to give up. And it was exactly at that moment that God began to move. Throughout this video, we're going to walk through their stories of surrender, faith, and transformation, to understand what truly happens when someone stops negotiating with God and decides to give it all up to Him. You'll see that total surrender isn't the end of freedom, it's the beginning of real life with God. And maybe, just maybe, this is the message your heart needed to hear today. God doesn't want the easiest part of your life. He wants it all, because it's in the all that the miracle happens. So before we dive into these stories, I want to invite you to reflect. What if God had 100% of your heart? What could He do through you? If that's the desire of your heart, write it here in the comments. Lord, I want to completely surrender to you. Now, get ready, because in the next scenes, you're going to see what really happens when a man or a woman gives themselves entirely to God. The story of surrender never begins with courage. It begins with yielding. Before God uses someone publicly, He first wins that person in secret, in those quiet hours when the soul wrestles between fear and faith. Many of the great men and women of God throughout history didn't start strong, quite the opposite. They began confused, weak, uncertain. George Miller was once known as deceitful and pleasure-loving before his conversion. John Wesley, before preaching to crowds, went through a season of spiritual emptiness, confessing in his journal that he preached faith that he did not yet possess. And Evan Roberts, the young Welsh coal miner, hesitated for weeks before obeying the call burning in his heart. They all had one thing in common. God was waiting for a yes. Not a yes based on feelings or clarity, but a yes that gives up control, even without understanding the path ahead. That was the turning point, because when a Christian says yes to God, without reservations, without guarantees, heaven moves. Picture the scene: a small room, a single lamp flickering, and a man on his knees whispering softly, "Lord, do with me whatever you will." No applause, no audience, no sound, but quiet sobs. Yet right there, in that moment, something begins to shift, not only within him, but in the world around him. It was this way for everyone who shaped generations. Visible transformation always began with an invisible act of surrender, because God isn't looking for talent, He's looking for willing hearts. And when He finds one, He does the impossible through it. Brothers and sisters, maybe that's exactly where you are right now, caught between comfort and calling, between fear and faith. And God is asking you the same question He asked them. Do you trust me enough to say yes? True surrender isn't a leap into darkness. It's a step toward the light, even when that light still feels far away. And it's in that first yes that God begins to write the stories that change the course of nations. But what happens when that surrender is tested? When saying yes costs you everything you have? That's when faith stops being theory and becomes life. And that's what we're about to see next: the price of total surrender. No story of deep surrender was ever written without tears, because when someone says, "Lord, take it all," God truly does. And He begins to work in the very places the heart tries hardest to hide. For Hudson Taylor, the price of surrender began with loneliness. While serving as a missionary in China, he lost his wife and young children. Yet even in the midst of grief, he wrote, "God is not taking the best from me. He is preparing me to trust Him even more." He didn't give up. His surrender, tested through pain, became the foundation of one of the greatest missionary movements in history. And anyone who reads about David Brainerd, the young missionary to the Native Americans, feels both the weight and the beauty of surrender. Living with fragile health and little provision, he prayed for hours in snow-covered forests, pleading for the salvation of a forgotten people. In one of his journals, he wrote, I was brought low before God and found joy only in belonging entirely to Him. Brainerd died young, but his journal inspired generations, including Jonathan Edwards, who helped spread his testimony around the world. Surrender always costs something. It costs reputation, comfort, stability. But the paradox of the kingdom is this: the more you lose, the more you gain, because what God gives back is infinitely greater than what He asks for. These men and women proved that surrender isn't the end of joy, it's the beginning of fullness. The fire on the altar consumes what is earthly, but what remains is refined gold. And in the end, they all say the same thing: it was worth it. Maybe you're in that same process right now, when it feels like God is taking more than He's giving. But what if He isn't taking anything at all, only preparing you to carry something eternal? Yes, the price is high, but it's the only path that turns an ordinary servant into an instrument of revival. And it's right there, at that very point, that the story shifts. Because when surrender is complete, the unseen begins to move. And what happens next? No one can explain. There's something mysterious about total surrender. It looks like weakness, but it's strength. It looks like loss, but it's the beginning of a harvest that outlives generations. Because when a man yields completely, God doesn't just transform him, He transforms everything around him. The greatest spiritual revolutions in history began in silence, in ordinary rooms, with broken hearts. They weren't planned through strategies, nor sustained by human influence. They were born out of what heaven values most: total obedience. Surrender isn't loud, yet it carries a power the world can't comprehend. It's like an invisible seed planted in the soil of the Spirit. No one sees when it dies, but everyone sees when it blooms. That's the logic of the kingdom. Power always follows surrender. When a believer stops fighting for control, God begins to move without limits. He opens doors that effort could never open. He shifts atmospheres without you even raising your voice. He does what only He can do, because there's no longer any resistance in you. The power of surrender isn't about doing more. It's about letting God do whatever He wills. It's not passivity, it's trust. It's not giving up. It's resting in the sovereignty of the one who never fails. Think about how many prayers have been answered through people who never sought fame, men and women who chose to remain hidden, yet left behind traces of eternity. The world never knew their names, but heaven never forgot them. Total surrender is the greatest secret of spiritual influence, because God uses yielded lives to fulfill plans that reach beyond a single generation. A prayer whispered today can alter the destiny of a family 100 years from now. A quiet act of obedience can reignite the flame in an entire nation. That's the invisible power of surrender. God moves where the ego has died, and where there is surrender, there is presence, and where there is presence, there is transformation. But what happens when that surrender is tested, when it feels like God is silent and faith begins to tremble? It's in that moment that the fire refines the gold, and surrender proves how real it truly is. Every true surrender passes through the fire, not the fire that destroys, but the fire that refines. It's easy to say, "Lord, everything is yours," when the doors are open and your heart is at peace. But the real test comes when God goes silent, and the path ahead seems to vanish beneath your feet. History shows that the greatest testimonies of faith weren't born in pulpits, but in lonely nights, when it felt like heaven had stopped listening. Those moments shape character. They reveal whether surrender is genuine or merely emotional. It was that way with David Livingstone, the missionary who carried the gospel into the jungles of Africa. In his journals, he described fevers, exhaustion, loneliness, and days when he prayed and saw no answers at all. Yet he still wrote, "God, I place my life as an offering upon the altar. Use me, even if no one ever sees." Silence didn't make him give up. It made him unshakable. And when Elizabeth Elliot lost her husband, who was killed in the jungles of Ecuador, she too was tested. She had every reason to turn back, yet chose to stay and forgive. Years later, she witnessed with her own eyes the very people who took her husband's life surrender to Christ. The fire of pain had purified her faith until it became a testimony. Brothers and sisters, maybe that's exactly where you are right now, praying and hearing nothing, waiting and watching doors stay closed. But remember this: God's silence isn't his absence, it's refinement. He's shaping you for something that can only be carried by a mature heart. Every life surrendered to God leaves a mark, even after the voice falls silent, because true surrender doesn't end with the person. It spreads. It multiplies through spiritual sons and daughters, through prayers that keep echoing, through fruit that blooms long after the seed was planted. Christian history is filled with these quiet traces of faithfulness. Men and women who never sought to be remembered, yet still touch hearts today because of how they lived and how they surrendered. And there are also the unknown ones, those history never recorded, women who prayed for their children until their last breath, men who faithfully upheld churches in silence, intercessors who never stood on pulpits, yet held generations together with uplifted hands. They didn't seek fame, they sought faithfulness. The legacy of surrender isn't measured by visible achievements, but by transformed lives. It's when one heart ignites another and the fire is passed on. That's how it's always been in every revival. Someone gave themselves fully, and others caught the flame. And there's something profoundly beautiful about that, because God never wastes a single act of surrender. The prayer whispered in secret, the hidden fast, the silent sacrifice, all of it is remembered. Every seed planted in pain blooms at the appointed time. Brothers and sisters, the world may never know what you've given, but heaven does, and heaven is the one that multiplies the impact of obedience. A single act of surrender today can become the spiritual awakening of an entire generation tomorrow. That's the legacy of surrender. God takes something small, hidden, and turns it into something immeasurable. And suddenly, what began with one yes changes stories, families, even nations. But there's an even greater truth. The legacy of surrender doesn't end in the past. It continues, and it can begin again, in you. Everything we've seen so far points to one single truth. God completely transforms those who completely surrender. There is no surrendered life that ever stays the same. When someone places everything in God's hands, their plans, dreams, desires, and fears, what comes back from his hands is always greater, purer, and eternal. But the question now isn't what he did through them. It's what he can do through you. Because surrender isn't just a memory from the past. It's an invitation for the present. God is still calling willing hearts. He's still searching for men and women who will say, "Lord, everything is yours." And when he finds someone like that, he does once again what he's always done. He turns the ordinary into the extraordinary. So before we close, I want to invite you to do the same thing so many before you once did. Not a symbolic gesture, but a real, deep, and sincere decision. If this message spoke to your heart, write here in the comments, "Lord, take all that I am." That way I'll know you made it to the end, and that you desire to live the same surrender that transformed generations. Because God is still writing stories, and perhaps the next one begins with your surrender. God bless you, and see you in the next video.